Ladies and gentlemen, CBS News. Alito tells congressional Democrats he won't recuse. They are trying desperately to get Samuel Alito off the immunity case and eventually the hush money decision. They're going to overturn the hush money decision if the New York Appeals Court does not, and I think the New York Court of Appeals will. The Supreme Court, and hit subscribe to this channel right now. You will hear legal scholars, you'll hear future President Trump, former and future President Trump in a couple of seconds. Hit subscribe right now. We're just a couple of subs away from 231,000 subscribers. I love you. It's because of you, and thank you so much for watching. The federal crime that Trump was convicted of is imaginary. It's actually invisible. There was no federal crime that we learned of. There was only a misdemeanor, a state-level misdemeanor that was elevated to a felony. The FEC did not find Trump. They fined Clinton and the DNC for purchasing the Steele dossier. There is no federal crime from the Department of Justice. This is why the Supreme Court can overturn the conviction. If the New York Court of Appeals does not, then the Supreme Court will overturn the conviction, and Samuel Alito and Justice Thomas, and even, it could be a 7-2. You might even get a liberal justice as well. When the state, any state, tries to convict a person using a federal statute without the Department of Justice actually leveling the statute, that is a big problem. That is unconstitutional. And that is why the Supreme Court will save the day again from very corrupt tyrants and despots and authoritarians and totalitarians who are good, morally superior liberal Democrats. To my super chat, thank you. To the members of this channel, thank you. Let's get started. This is the great Professor Dershowitz talking about the constitutional dilemmas and the egregious unconstitutional activity against Trump. This is under the auspices or the purview or the authority of the federal government now, because the FEC laws were said to have been broken, but the FEC fined Clinton and the DNC for purchasing the Steele dossier. The federal government, the United States government, did not level any charges against Trump. So this guilty verdict is unconstitutional and will either be overturned at the state level, and if it's not overturned at the state level, 100% certainty it'll be overturned in the Supreme Court. Justice Alito, as you can see, is staying on every single case. He will lead, along with Justice Thomas, the charge to overturn an unconstitutional guilty verdict pertaining to a federal law that doesn't exist, that Trump allegedly broke. Bradley Smith, Hans A. von Spakovsky, two FEC chairmen, stated there was no law that Trump broke. This is the very respected, awesome Professor Dershowitz right here.
100%. I want to say right now, I side with President Trump's assessment of the judicial system more than President Biden's assessment. I'm a liberal Democrat. I voted for Biden. Biden is dead wrong. We should not respect the legal system that is rigged. In my book, Get Trump, I predicted months before this case ever came to trial that it was a foregone conclusion there'd be a conviction. A biased judge, a biased jury, a biased prosecutor, a man who ran for office on the theory of let's find a crime to prosecute Trump for, and they couldn't find the crime, so they made it up. We're now a day after the verdict. I've known criminal law. I've been involved in criminal law 60 years. I still don't know what the crime is.
Right.
Was he found guilty of intending to violate tax laws, to violate the federal election laws, to defraud the voters? I still don't know, and we're a day after this.
Samuel Stafford, thank you. To my super chat, thank you. Samuel, Paul, Nicholas, everybody here, thank you so much. Samuel Stafford, so greatly appreciated, so generous of you as always. Ladies and gentlemen, there was no federal crime. And I think I muted myself, so I was talking a couple seconds before Professor Dershowitz was speaking. There was no federal crime that Trump broke. The reason that Bradley Smith, the FEC chairman, and Samuel, thank you again, the reason that Bradley Smith, the FEC chairman, was not allowed to testify is because he would have told the court that there's no federal law that Trump broke. The misdemeanors when past were past the statutes of limitations. Okay, so these were misdemeanors. The record-keeping violations when past the statute of limitations. They were civil fines, misdemeanors. They were not felonies. The misdemeanors were elevated, were boosted to felonies. Okay, because they said that Trump committed a federal crime in concert as he was committing record-keeping violations. This is absurd. The Department of Justice did not charge Trump with anything. The Federal Election Commission only went after Clinton, the Clinton campaign, I should say, and the Democratic National Committee for purchasing the Steele dossier, a compilation of blatant lies and information that misinforms, from a foreign operative, only for the purpose of influencing 2016 and beyond. Trump, even if he told Michael Cohen to pay Stormy, even if he had a romantic relationship with Stormy, that would have been legal under FEC laws, because the expenditure would have taken place with or without 2016. He would have wanted to protect his family or image with or without 2016. He didn't have to run for president to want to keep a potential romantic relationship secret. So it's not a campaign finance issue. That's how you get the Supreme Court to come to the rescue if the New York Court of Appeals doesn't do its job. Samuel, again, thank you so very, very much. Hit subscribe if you're new, people. We're almost at 231,000 subs.
This is the most outrageous case. You know, everybody knows the quote from Lavrenti Beria, the head of the KGB, and Stalin, when Beria said to Stalin,
show me the man and I'll show you the crime.
No, find you the crime.
Find you the crime, yeah.
Tried to find the crime, and he couldn't. So he made up the crime. He took it a step further than Stalin and Lavrenti Beria. This case will go down in history as one of the most abusive prosecutions since the trial of Aaron Burr back in 18 whatever it was. This is a stain on our criminal justice
really is. And by the way, you're not the only liberal Democrat saying that. We had this interesting piece that was in the New York Magazine, of all places, by a CNN analyst, Elie Honig. I don't know if you saw it, came out this morning. He says the charges against Trump are obscure and nearly entirely unprecedented. In fact, as you say, made up. No state prosecutor in New York or Wyoming or anywhere has ever charged federal election laws as a direct or predicate state crime against anyone for anything.
You can look, ladies and gentlemen, look at the way Democrats desperately hide the truth about Hunter's laptop. 50 intel officials came out of nowhere, said it was a Kremlin plot to inform you of how criminal Democrats are. It's always a plot by another country to inform you of crimes committed by Democrats. The Daily Mail, especially the New York Post, both of those publications, the Federalist, they all deserve Pulitzer Prizes. Because the New York Post broke the story. You have potential bribery and graft within those emails. You have foreign policy and national security compromised potentially within those emails. And then you have top secret intelligence on private servers that weren't even connected to U.S. government servers. You had how do you migrate or transfer top secret data from the Department of Defense onto Clinton servers? It's not even possible from a cybersecurity perspective. Yet Democrats and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, government agencies, they didn't charge Democrats. Biden had classified data in 4 to 5 or 6 different locations, including potentially a university. And he was a senator. He didn't have the power to declassify like Trump. And it doesn't matter if he worked with the government. Like if you rob a bank and you say, "Excuse me, I will work with you, no problem." Nobody cares. If you commit a crime, it's not like it's not like you see an episode on Cops. I'll work with you, officers. So Democratic nonsense as well. Biden, he worked with the government, and Trump didn't. Trump had his legal team. They were negotiating. He had every right legally to negotiate as a former president with the power to declassify. So anyway, you can see the double standard. It's unbelievable. And Trump, when he gets back into office, and he'll win. Mark my words, he'll win. I told everyone that Clinton would lose to Trump in 2016. I'm telling you right now, Trump will win. Thank God he'll win. And he needs to, as president, react in a reciprocal manner. He needs to behave in a reciprocal manner. It's like the James Brown song, The Big Payback.
None ever. So you're not the only liberal Democrat who believes that. I just wonder how many other folks out there who used to be against Trump are now in his favor.
I can tell you, I get calls, whispered calls from liberal Democrat friends of mine saying, "You're 100% right, but I won't say it publicly because I'm so thrilled that Trump got convicted, even though the conviction was outrageous." You get a lot of liberals who believe with Ellie Honig and me that this is an unjustified conviction. We're willing to say it, but they're not willing to say it. And there's dancing on the streets, and there are people who are just, I get these emails. They're so thrilled that we violated the Constitution in order to get Trump. I have people telling me.
And the Constitution, his rights, his First Amendment rights, other rights were trampled upon. Okay, it was an unconstitutional decision. Okay, the federal government would have had to, the Department of Justice would have had to level charges against Trump. They know very well that they can't, because in a federal court, if they did level charges like federal charges, they would have to have former FEC chairman. They would have to allow Trump the ability to get former FEC chairman to defend him in court. They didn't want that. That's why the court in New York did not allow Bradley Smith to testify on Trump's behalf, to say the former Federal Election Commission chairman, you'll hear in a second. Because if he was able to testify, he would have stated there was no federal election law that Trump broke. So you can't elevate or boost the misdemeanors into felonies. So those 34 guilty charges, those 34 charges that he was allegedly guilty on, which of course he's not, were the different payments were tied to 11 or so or more payments to Michael Cohen, which, by the way, Michael Cohen testified in Congress he has no evidence that any of those payments, that he could prove that Trump paid him to pay Stormy. But again, even if Trump paid Stormy from his own personal checkbook, it would not be a campaign finance law violation. It's like, even when they convict Trump, they still lose because they actually do commit crimes. You can't have private servers and laptops full of graft and bribery. Sorry. These are like blatant crimes. Okay, you can't trade on your post as an American official for money, which is what Democrats do. Okay? You can't use a foundation or a business as a quote-unquote intermediary. That's what Democrats do. This is against the law. And you can actually prove that because you have the money flow, you have people testifying, you have emails in this case, you have deleted emails, you have emails the New York Post broke where they're literally asking for influence. And these are bribery and graft statutes. These are federal statutes you could easily prove. And then when they say, well, we don't have anything on, yeah, you do. You have an entire laptop that the Bureau has and that apparently Rudy Giuliani has a copy of, or maybe others have a copy of. But the point is they go to bat and defend everybody on the left that commits crimes, and then they jump in, for joy in the streets when Trump is convicted of the most absurd, comical, sad, miserable attempt at trying to get a former president. And everyone is now the Supreme Court's involved. They can't even convict Trump without the United States Supreme Court getting involved eventually if the Court of Appeals doesn't. And they tried to ban Trump, and it was a unanimous Supreme Court decision overturning the Colorado ban. Even the 3 liberal justices joined in.
Getting Trump elected is worse than undoing the Constitution. That's how extreme some of these people are. And, it's not only this case, it's the 3 other cases. I go over each of them in my book, Get Trump. And every single one of them is based on conceptions that are in violation of the rule of law. This was the weakest case. This was.
In many ways, I love $29
case, but it was in a very good jurisdiction.
But even Professor Dershowitz, did you imagine in your book or even a few weeks ago that the judge himself would bring so much of that prejudice? People are allowed to have their opinions. People are allowed to be inconsistent. But the judge is supposed to keep prejudice out of the courtroom. And his instructions to the jury, I've never seen anything like it. Somebody just called it a roadmap to conviction, which is essentially what it was. The judge is supposed to be neutral, if anything, on the side of the defense, because it's the prosecution that has to prove that something has been done illegally. But in this case, he was providing the jury with a road to conviction, was he not?
Yes. In fact, the day before the conviction, I wrote a column saying this was a directed verdict by the judge, that the judge was directing the jury to convict. And by the way, he didn't have to. The jury would have convicted anyway. Once the jury was selected from New York voters, 85% of whom don't want to see Trump as.
The best part was when they were asking the potential jurors, where do you get your news? And they're like, CNN and the New York Times. It's like, well, okay. The CNN was viewed as an objective, nonpartisan, apolitical source.
As their president, the die was cast. This case should have been tried in a different county. It should have been tried in Staten Island or in Rockland County, where you get some chance of getting a fair jury. This was an unfair jury from the beginning.
One soundbite from Mark Levin, who was talking, because some people are saying there's no way it could get to the Supreme Court before the election. He's saying we've got to kind of push it in that direction. Can you roll that Mark Levin tape, please?
Do we allow this to go by without trying to bring the matter to the steps of the Supreme Court, whether the Supreme Court takes it or not? I'm not a Nostradamus.
The Supreme Court will take it if it gets to the Supreme Court. It's a federal issue. They already ruled unanimously, and I like Mark Levin, and he's being honest. I'm not Nostradamus either, but it will definitely be seen if the Court of Appeals in the state of New York upholds the guilty verdict against Trump in a blatantly unconstitutional, partisan, despotic attempt at removing a candidate. I mean, these people talk about democracy, and they've acted in the most authoritarian, tyrannical manner. The Supreme Court already, in a unanimous decision, overturned the Colorado ban. I'm telling you, it might not be unanimous, but it would be, I think you'd get at least one liberal justice to side with, it would be a 7-2 Even if it's a 6-3 or 5-4, it doesn't matter. But the Supreme Court would definitely overturn, because it's a federal issue. But he's not charged with a federal crime. Only Democrats could convict Trump of a federal crime without the Department of Justice actually charging Trump. It's unbelievable.
Maybe there's a 10% chance, but the country's worth it.
So is there, I think back to 2000 during the election between Bush and Gore, when the Supreme Court realized this was critical to an election. I mean, this is critical to an election as well. Is it possible to persuade them to take the case before the election happens?
Yes. Mark once called me Nostradamus because my predictions have always been true about what we'll do. If the court granted review in this case, they would reverse. And I think there's a way of expediting the appeal, skipping the appellate division, going right to the Court of Appeals, ask for an expedited appeal with a decision within a month, and then take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court should take this case, should reverse the conviction, and let the voters decide who should be president without the thumb of an illegal prosecution.
And they've gone after Justice Clarence Thomas, the same Democrats who go out, who disparage Trump for going after judges. They have been so vile against Kavanaugh. Chuck Schumer went after Kavanaugh in the most egregious manner, and then a deranged person from a blue state tried to end Kavanaugh's life. Okay? And so whenever Democrats have their words lead to violence and mayhem and possible catastrophe, they just, forget that. It's not a big deal. It's definitely the deranged Trumpers. Oh, they're the big problem. We have billions in property damage that summer throughout the country. Hundreds and hundreds of law enforcement officials injured throughout the country. And they focus on one day. Yeah, terrible day. And I agree with why people peacefully demonstrated that summer. But I mean, Democrats have political amnesia. They pick and choose what they want. They feign indignation and they pretend to care about democracy and the Constitution. They are so desperate. Their entire lives are predicated upon. And it used to be the Bush Republicans were like this too. But now it's the wonderful, morally superior liberal Democrats who are just like the Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld Republicans of 20 years ago. Political power drives the Democratic Party. It has nothing to do with the Constitution, equity, any of their bizarre ideologies. They just care about political influence and power. That's it. That's why they want Alito to recuse himself, and he's like, no. That's why they wanted Clarence Thomas, and they're like, no. He's like, no. And they already, like I said, they already overturned the unconstitutional Colorado ban unanimously. But this is Hans A. von Spakovsky. So check out Hans A. von Spakovsky. He's awesome. And he was on Fox Business. And this is the Heritage Foundation. Subscribe to the Heritage Foundation. And he works at the Heritage Foundation as a scholar there, a legal scholar, and he's just awesome. Former FEC chairman. You'll hear Bradley Smith also. Both Bradley Smith and Hans A. von Spakovsky have stated this thing is a complete farce.
Well, I have the same reaction Francie Hakes does. This is a travesty, a miscarriage of justice. This was a phony prosecution from the very beginning. And for this jury, think about how many weeks this trial went on, how many witnesses came in, and in the very short time that the jury was out, they decided he was guilty on all 34 charges. This is a damage to the reputation of the American justice system like we have never seen. I have a colleague just got back from a conference overseas, and the reaction of lawyers and people there was that the United States has now gotten to be like the countries they are from, where the government uses its law enforcement powers to go after its political opponents. And that, I think, is exactly what happened here.
Hans, what was the underlying federal campaign violation? Did we ever find that out?
Well, there was nothing in the original indictment about any kind of federal campaign violation. They kept saying that the legal expenses, which is what were listed in the business records, should have been a campaign-related expense, the payment that was made to Stormy Daniels. But as Brad Smith, I know, would have testified, under the test applied by the FEC, this was not a campaign-related expense, period. There's just no question about that. So for this jury to say that, oh yeah, he violated federal campaign finance laws and that justifies the underlying verdict, that is such an egregious mistake that the Court of Appeals in New York, when they get this case, they ought to reverse this almost immediately. Because
And if the Court of Appeals does not, or if they bypass the Court of Appeals, they get to the Supreme Court, like the very respected Hans A. von Spakovsky is saying, there was no federal crime in the original indictment. I mean, this is so simple. And it took me a second to realize this also, because I said, okay, if the Court of Appeals, one thing I was worried about, ladies and gentlemen, I said, if the Court of Appeals in New York sides with the guilty verdict, where does Trump go from here? And then I realized with a little research, there's no federal crime. You would need the Department of Justice to level a federal crime, okay? If you, for example, are, this criminal and you're doing a whole bunch of, things that are federal crimes and state crimes, the Department of Justice also indicts you and the state also indicts you. So, or the indictment lists the federal crimes from the DOJ indictment. So, but Trump didn't have that. Trump had a record-keeping violation, while Democrats have bribery and graft and laptops, private servers with top-secret intel, foundations that are laundering hundreds of millions, potentially, possibly, as the Honorable James Comey says, potentially, when he was asked on CNN if he might testify against Andrew McCabe. He said, potentially. You gotta love it. This is fantastic. Potentially. And also when he said that hostile actors might have infiltrated Clinton's servers. It was possible, potentially. Anyway, there's no federal crime. Democrats are so inept. They're such failures. When they actually convict Trump, they then forget to actually find the crime. So there is no federal crime. And if it's a federal issue, the Supreme Court's involved. If it was just the misdemeanors, the Supreme Court, I don't think, would be able to overturn anything. But it's a federal issue. The federal election laws, there were none that were broken. And the FEC fined Clinton and the DNC, not Trump. So if it gets to the Supreme Court, no doubt it gets overturned in the most colossal, monumental, historic, amazing rebuke of the true authoritarians, totalitarians, despots, tyrants, the wonderful, morally superior, good, just awesome liberal Democrats who look in the mirror and say, I'm such a good human being, a moral human being. Oh, that's right. Maybe we're the despots and the baddies. Maybe we actually are the authoritarians that we were afraid Trump might be.
Because of this and so many other mistakes made in the case.
How many do you count? How many mistakes?
I lost count of how many errors were made by this judge and by the prosecutors were made. Made in the case.
How many do you count? How many mistakes?
I lost count of how many errors were made by this judge and by the prosecution. I mean, the judge let in all kinds of irrelevant evidence that had no bearing on the charges against the president.
They let Stormy go on and on about the alleged romantic encounter, which has nothing to do. Even if Stormy is telling the truth, It has nothing to do with the case. It's nothing to do. It's just the way they roll. They despise Trump because he defeated them. End of story. That's the only reason. It has nothing to do with his personality. He's not polarizing. He's not mean. He's not, this or that. If Trump was a Democrat, they would rally around him. They'd say, "Oh my God, he's so strong and courageous, and he takes the fight to the political opponents." But because he defeated them, suddenly their sensibilities are, oh my God, it's like the end of the world, everything he does. They have obsessed over Trump because, for about 20, 30 years, Republicans have looked, for example, at the Clintons and said, hey, they're committing criminal acts and nothing happens. So they had to cram about 20 years of looking at Democrats and saying, hey, wait a second, you're committing crimes and nothing's taking place. They had to, within a span of 6 to 7 years, turn Democrats into Republicans looking at Democrats and seeing them get away with crimes, if that makes any sense.
But we're obviously there to blacken the character of Donald Trump. The judge shouldn't have even been on the case. He should have recused himself because of his personal family dealings, his daughter's involvement, his making political contributions in violation of the ethics rules in New York. There are just so many mistakes and errors he made that I don't see how a court of appeals could not overturn this verdict.
So Samuel Alito has a homeowners association problem, and they're like, recuse yourself, recuse. But you can actually be a judge and donate to the Democratic Party, and that's totally fine. It's totally fine. No, oh my God, no recusal. But Alito has a homeowners association. It's like, oh my God, it's the worst thing ever. Recuse yourself. And then they go after Justice Thomas's wife when everyone related to Democrats overseeing Trump's prosecution are so involved within the Democratic Party. It's unbelievable, and nobody recuses themselves. But Justice Thomas should recuse himself. Okay. This is Bradley Smith, the man who would have testified had he been able to, and listen to what he says.
Well, we know why they're not indicted, right? Because we don't want to indict them. But no, it's a good example of things that influence the campaign. And it's worth noting that under the FEC's regulations, if you're an incumbent office holder, you're presumed to be running for re-election. So you're all presumed to be candidates unless they've announced that they're not seeking re-election. So they would be candidates, and this is something that they probably did to influence their future campaign or their perception as office holders. And one thing that's worth adding here, Mark, is because I hear this from people all the time, and even some other, election people who know election law, lawyers and some former other commissioners will say, yes, but it was to influence any election. But the FEC in its regulations very specifically rejected the idea that even as to whether it was primarily to influence the election or not, and choosing instead this test that it has to be an obligation that was created for the election. In other words, they didn't want to get into the question of trying to guess, well, did they do this primarily for the election or primarily for personal purposes?
That's why the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee were fined for purchasing the Steele dossier. Nobody would have a reason to purchase a dossier full of lies and deceit were it not for the 2016 campaign. That's the only reason that Democrats bought the dossier from a foreign operative, by the way. Typical hypocrites. Trump would have paid Stormy, if indeed he wanted to, at any point in his life, with or without an election. Just like celebrities do all the time.
Purposes, and it's very specific about that in the regulations, and I think that's a very important point that people need to keep in mind. And that was done actually to make it more objective and actually to prevent candidates from using their campaign funds for personal use. But that's the flip side. And I tell people, imagine if you're a lawyer for the Trump campaign and you want to do it all right. You've got one provision of the statute says I have to pay it with campaign funds. Another provision seems to say I can't pay it with campaign funds. Somebody's going to get them coming or going, and that's part of the problem.
So if you're a lawyer for the Trump campaign or the coming Trump campaign, you would do pretty much what Donald Trump did. No campaign money, consult your private lawyer, and they enter into these non-disclosure agreements. Greg, let me ask you this. Isn't the real issue here is people were actually paid under the non-disclosure agreements and then they violated the non-disclosure agreements? I don't see them giving the money back.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I think it's malpractice for the attorney for Stormy Daniels to say, go ahead and talk while the case is pending as to whether or not it's a valid and enforceable non-disclosure agreement. So it's stunning to me. But to Bradley's point, not everything that benefits a candidate is considered to be a campaign expense. Professor Smith wrote that in one of his op-eds, and he's absolutely right. If there is
The former Federal Election Commission chairman wrote in an op-ed, not everything that benefits a candidate is a campaign expense. For example, it could benefit Trump to have attempted to hide a relationship with Stormy, and also it would have protected Melania and his family, his brand, and any embarrassment. End of story. No longer a campaign finance issue. However, if he purchased a dossier full of lies and deceit to deceive his base the way Democrats did to deceive their base, and they're still trying to find a tape of Trump going to the bathroom in a hotel room. I mean, if Democrats don't believe in hoaxes and lies and fantasies and a fabricated consensus of only experts they agree with, whereas experts they disagree with should never have been born, they're excommunicated, they commit blasphemy, and they should not be listened to. If Democrats don't have this perfectly manicured, manufactured world of the antithesis of rationality, but a world that caters to their morally superior liberal sensibilities, I mean, who knows what happens to their political party? They claim that Trump and Trump supporters are a cult that are not rational. But the most irrational people are Democrats who think that Trump worked with the Kremlin or that he's guilty of a campaign finance law that literally hasn't been leveled at him by the federal government, and that FEC chairman stated was not a campaign finance issue.
a dual purpose or a secondary purpose. It's not a campaign expense. And moreover, the media rushed and said, oh, Cohen pled guilty, the president must be guilty. That's utter nonsense. First of all, under the Federal Campaign Election Act and other related laws that criminalize violations, there has to be knowledge. You have to show that there was a knowing and deliberate violation of the law in order for it to be criminal. Well, most candidates don't know the election law. Heck, a lot of lawyers don't understand election laws. This gentleman, the former commissioner, the Federal Election Commission, chairman, I mean, he knows election law. He may be just about the only one in America who really truly knows it. So you couldn't criminalize what Trump did if it wasn't properly accounted for as an advance or reimbursement. Okay, that's a civil penalty. It's the equivalent of a jaywalking $500 fine, but it's certainly not a crime.
I did a search. It didn't take me long. Of all the federal candidates who've been charged and been convicted of violating these laws, I can't find a single one. Are you aware of a single one?
For this kind of scenario?
This kind of scenario?
No, I'm really not. Of course, the most high-profile one would be John Edwards from a few years ago.
And what happened in
Folks may remember that supporters were paying funds, money to a woman, Riley Hunter, I believe was her name, with whom he'd had an affair and an illegitimate child. And now it's worth noting, the U.S. attorney indicted him, so they went to trial on it. So the U.S. attorney thought there was a case, but in the end, The jury did not convict. He was acquitted on some charges and others was a hung jury. And I think that shows the tremendous difficulty. And, one quick little anecdote when we talk about how obscure this law is, how difficult, is Antonin Scalia, who was, a reasonably good lawyer, right, actually said from the bench in the Supreme Court argument once that this campaign finance law is so complex, I can't figure it out. So if we've got a Supreme Court justice can't figure it out, you see the problems that people have when they're trying to deal with it on a daily basis.
And do you know, ladies and gentlemen, who used to clerk for Antonin Scalia? I believe it's Amy Coney Barrett. Do you know who was best friends with Antonin Scalia? Justice Clarence Thomas, Justice Samuel Alito. Okay, so I believe Roberts was also friends with Antonin Scalia. So there's no way they're going to uphold a guilty verdict that doesn't even list a specific federal statute leveled by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice would have had to have leveled a statute against Trump. They didn't do that. This is John Yoo also talking about the egregious conduct violating the Constitution against Trump.
I hope so, because Michael Cohen could be the worst kind of witness any U.S. or state attorney would ever want to build their whole case on. And I don't actually think you need a list of 10, although I think Todd Blanche should be praised for getting it down to 10. It's really just one, because the jury is there to decide questions of fact. The only real fact that the government has to prove here is, what is Donald Trump's mental state? Did he intend to deceive? And the only person the prosecution put on to prove that was Michael Cohen. So if Todd Blanche can just focus the attack on Cohen's credibility, that destroys the government's whole case.
Professor Yoo, jury instructions can make or break cases. They're critical. We will learn soon what is in those jury instructions. But it's confounding to me, to Lydia Hu, our producer in the courtroom, to Shannon Bream, as I'm reading their notes, that we still don't know that second crime that would elevate this misdemeanor. As Shannon Bream says, I'll quote her, "This is one of those points that seems most ripe for appeal." I presume, like any other defendant, Donald Trump would have a Sixth Amendment right to know the charges against him, wouldn't he?
That's a good point. There's a serious question about whether the prosecution has actually violated the Constitution in the way they've concealed the second crime. Recall that the first crime is just a misdemeanor, this bookkeeping entry business. It only becomes a felony, which is something worth jail time, if it's used to cover up or to enable some greater felony. The prosecution has still to tell us what that second felony is. It's actually hard for the jury to decide whether Donald Trump's guilty or not if they don't actually know what the crime is. Now, a good judge, an impartial judge, would send this case back to the prosecutors and say, you can't proceed any further. Instead, Judge Mershon just sort of let it go, see what's going to happen. He'll still have another chance, I think, to decide whether the whole case should be thrown out because of that legal vulnerability on the part of the prosecution.
Do you think he'll take that?
Coach O'Connor, thank you. Thomas O'Connor, thank you so very, very much. Thank you for watching. Coach, since 2016, thank you. Clown World, I love your optimism, sir. Ex-libs, make the best. That's true. That's true, but you know why? Because you can see Clown World, I was able to leave a very unhealthy political realm. To be a liberal Democrat or progressive, to be to the left of center, is the most unhealthy existence. It really is. Nancy, thank you. Trump is the most thoroughly investigated man in U.S. history. He is. He is. Thank you so very much, Nancy Patterson. Thank you. He absolutely is. And I mean, if they spent 10% of the time they spent investigating Trump, investigating Democrats with private servers and laptops and businesses and foundations that are very likely linked to bribery and graft, well, I mean, it's like you wouldn't be wondering what the federal crime is. Nancy, thank you. Thomas O'Connor, Coach O'Connor, thank you. Samuel Stafford, Thank you so very much, Clown World. Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's go ahead and listen to future President Trump right now.
But you can't testify. So essentially, he wasn't able to testify. Other people weren't able to testify. But with these people, they were able to use people salacious. By the way, and nothing ever happened. There was no anything. Nothing ever happened.
But even if something did happen, it's not a campaign finance law issue. I mean, whether or not Stormy, had a romantic thing with Trump is completely irrelevant. That's why her testimony was just salacious and nonsensical. It had nothing to do with the federal laws that were conveniently not leveled against Trump by the federal government, which is why the Supreme Court would strike this and overturn and reverse this unconstitutional guilty verdict.
They know it, but they were as salacious as they could be, and it had nothing to do with the case, but it had to do with politics. And do you notice the timing? The timing was perfect. This case was dead. It was dropped by every agency, every governmental board. It was dropped by the highly respected Southern District. They said, no, there's no case here. It was dropped by federal election, and that's what it's about. This is about a federal election, not a state election. You're not even allowed to look at it. They took the state and the city, and they went into a federal election. They're not allowed. The people from federal election, Southern District, and Washington dropped the case. Everybody dropped the case. There was no case. Cy Vance dropped.
Well,
and when Bragg came in, he said, this is the most ridiculous case I've ever seen. And who would have a certain person, again, gag order, who would have a certain person like this ever testify? He said, this is essentially one of the worst people I've ever seen ever to testify. He said, the craziest case I've ever seen. This is Bragg. Then when I announced I was running for president, long time later, they decided to revive this case. And they got a judge, and having to do essentially a little bit with me. They weren't crimes. They weren't crimes. Nor is paying money under an NDA. So we have an NDA.
Everybody uses an NDA in business. If you're a consultant, you use a non-disclosure agreement. If you are working with a manufacturer of any kind, you will use a non-disclosure agreement. You don't want, the manufacturer, for example, doesn't want any proprietary knowledge or how their machinery works to be out in the open. NDAs are used every single day in business. And if Stormy accepted the $100,000 or so, the question is the issue of extortion. Trump is yet again the victim here. He paid, somebody paid the money. It wasn't Trump. Let's say Michael Cohen did pay the money. He got a home loan, an equity line of credit, as he was not telling the IRS about $4 million. And so, and then he had taxi cab medallions. And for the life of me, I just keep on, saying, I love New York. I mean, I love New York. I've only had the most amazing memories in New York. And I just remember years back, getting taxis, hailing taxis. And this was before Uber. Okay. And so, but I don't get why taxi companies in New York, for example, didn't just develop an app to compete with Uber. I mean, in the chat, if you could tell me, I don't get it. I just don't get it. I'm like Harry Carey. I don't get it. I can't understand why.
Non-disclosure agreement. It's a big deal in non-disclosure agreement. Totally honorable, totally good, totally accepted. Everybody has them. Every company has non-disclosure agreements. But the press called it slush fund and all sorts of other things. Hush money, hush money. It's not hush money. It's called a non-disclosure agreement. And most of the people in this room have a non-disclosure agreement with their company. It's a disgrace. So it's not hush money. It's a non-disclosure agreement, totally legal, totally common. Everyone has it. And what happened is he signed a non-disclosure agreement with this person, I guess other people, but it's totally honest. You're allowed to make the payment. You don't have to make it. You can make it any way you want. It's a non-disclosure agreement. And he signed that. And there was nothing wrong with signing it. And this should have been a non-case. And everybody said it was a non-case, including Bragg. Bragg said, until I ran for office. And then they saw the polls. I was leading the Republicans. I was leading the Democrats. I was leading everybody. And all of a sudden, they brought it back. It's a very sad thing that's happening in our country. And it's a thing that I'm honored. In a way, I'm honored. It's not that it's pleasant. It's very bad for family. It's very bad for friends and businesses. But I'm honored to be involved in it because somebody has to do it. And I might as well keep going and be the one. But I'm very honored to be involved because we're fighting for our Constitution.
Ladies and gentlemen, God bless this man. This man, Donald Trump, is a very heroic, courageous man. You know, I was a left-leaning, far left-leaning person most of my life up until about 6-7 years ago. The far left thinks that it's working against a corrupt system and it's, fighting a machine. They are the machine. Notice that every single socialist or communist or left-leaning pundit says, vote for Hillary Clinton, vote for Joe Biden. They're part of the machine. If they don't say vote for the Democratic nominee, they'll lose friends, family, subs. They will be ostracized. They will have committed blasphemy, heresy. They'll be excommunicated from an actual cult. Okay? And so I saw that when I was a Bernie Sanders supporter, which is embarrassing to both me and the people who still support Bernie Sanders. But when I said I would only vote for Bernie Sanders, not Clinton, it was like, oh my God, I committed heresy. And Trump actually does fight a very corrupt system. Trump fights a very corrupt system that is acting like the people going after Trump are the actual authoritarians, tyrants, despots, totalitarians. They don't see that. They don't see themselves as that because they view Trump as this existential issue, but that's really their own ego and narcissism talking. They just don't like Trump because he defeated Clinton, and they thought that President Obama and Clinton and Democrats would be in the Oval Office forever. They never imagined that Trump would defeat them. And when they were mortified and, tearing up in the Jacob Javits Center, they wanted revenge. So the past 7 years has been an unmitigated temper tantrum by Democrats, culminating now into, an unconstitutional guilty verdict that will be overturned, just like the Colorado ban was overturned by the Supreme Court. Hit subscribe, people. Thank you. God bless you. Samuel Stafford, everybody here. Samuel, thank you as always. Everybody here, Coach O'Connor, everyone here, thank you. And hit subscribe. We'll probably reach 231,000 subs by tomorrow, maybe even later tonight. And it's because of you, everybody. Thank you. Paul Bartlett, I love you, buddy. Thank you. I hope all is well, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow. Now we get to decide, will it be house arrest? Who knows? It ain't going to be Rikers Island, but it'll be possibly house arrest. Who knows? Then the Supreme Court also can get involved. You can't stop a presidential candidate from campaigning. Anyway, hit subscribe. I'll be back